Hey, if you're a music producer, then I'm pretty sure that you struggled at least once in your lifetime to get a great snare drum for your production. Why is that? Well, as I said in previous videos, I think that the snare is the most important part of the drum kit. The snare sound can define the sound of a whole album. Just think of Saint Anger of Metallica or other iconic snare sounds like the biggest snare from Slipknot. So, if you want to have a great sounding album, it is especially important to get the snare right. What do I mean by that? Well, the sound of the snare has to suit the style of the music. Just imagine the bingy Slipknot snare that I just mentioned in a ballad. I think that wouldn't work great, and also the other way around, if you have a big fat snare drum in a Slipknot song, that wouldn't be the best sound either. And one particular thing that I always find annoying to get it right with snare drums is the snare bottom mic. I mean, we've all been there, we all struggled with snare bottom mics, which by themselves just sound awful, but we need them to add that sizzle to the snare top mic. I mean, this makes sense if you think about where the snare top mic usually is positioned. It is just a centimeter over the snare top head. And I think and I hope that nobody has ever their ear this close to the snare top head, and if we put a mic there, the snare sounds rather unnatural to us. That's why we add a snare bottom mic. And as I said, the snare bottom mic isn't usually the best sounding track in our production, and this is why I want to show you in this video 5 different ways on how to get better snare sounds with some creative snare bottom techniques. I must admit that not all of these 5 techniques sound better than a traditional snare bottom microphone, but if you play around with these techniques, you may end up with a better drum sound. So let's open up a drum recording and I will show you my 5 snare bottom tips for better drum sounds. Okay, so here we have the drum recording, we have a kick out mic. As you can hear, all these tracks are already processed, so we have a fairly good sounding drum kit. Here we have the snare drum. Right now you will hear the traditional snare bottom microphone. I do have here some snare trigger tracks, but they are not used, so you hear just a natural snare drum. It is a quite ringy snare drum, but somehow I like the character of it, and we have some overheads. And obviously in this video we will focus on the snare and the snare bottom in particular. So let's listen to the whole drum kit with a traditional mic setup, so a dynamic microphone on top and a condenser on the bottom side of the snare drum. Let's solo the snare bottom. And you can hear that this isn't the greatest sound on earth, but if I mute the snare bottom mic in the whole drum mix, you will hear that something is missing. You lose the sizzle of the snare wires on the bottom side of the snare drum and also some depth of the snare drum. So if you forgot to record your snare bottom mic, or you don't have any spare channels left on your interface or any mics left, or you just don't like the sound of your snare bottom mic recording, you can always do the first tip that I want to show you today, which is you use a sample. So in this case I have down here a sample track with trigger on it, and I use the Tama Bell Brass Snare Bottom Mic, a sample from the CLA expansion of Slate Trigger, which honestly sounds great. So let's listen to the whole drum mix with this sample. You saw me flipping the phase of the snare sample track, and this is something that I always recommend to check the phase relation of your original drum track and the drum samples that you are adding. Now let's listen and let's switch between the snare sample and the original snare bottom track. Once again to the snare without any snare bottom signal. In this case, I have to say that I like my recorded snare bottom mic better. This isn't always the case, but in this drum recording I feel that the snare bottom mic just has more life to it, more depth, and somehow adds more excitement to the snare drum. Now let's jump to tip number 2, and that is to place the snare bottom mic not directly under the snare drum, but to use a boundary mic like the Shure Beta 91, which I used in my case, and to place that under the snare drum on the floor. I think the added distance from the snare head adds even more life and excitement to the snare drum, but you will get more kick drum in your mic obviously, because the mic is also nearer to the kick drum. But I will show you a trick how to tame the kick drum in the snare bottom mic, which is on the floor. So here is the Beta 91, which is on the floor without any processing on it. And I have here the FabFilter Pro G plugin, which I'm using in ducking mode, and I sidechained the kick drum to it. So if I addition the sidechain, we have the kick. So now every time I hit the kick, FabFilter Pro G will turn down the signal by 12 dB. So the snare will stay the same level, but the kick drum will get turned down 12 dB. Let's listen to the difference. First without the ducker, then with. Notice that there is also an EQ after the gate plugin. This is just to shape the frequency curve a little bit. And now let's listen to the whole drum mix with this new snare bottom mic on the floor. I will first mute it and then enable it. And now let's compare that once again to the traditional snare bottom mic technique. I think that this microphone on the floor adds a lot of body and depth to the snare drum, so for this drum recording I prefer the snare bottom mic on the floor over the traditional snare bottom mic directly under the snare. And now to snare bottom trick number 3, and that is using pink noise and a gate to recreate the sound of a snare bottom mic. Let's see how this is done. So here I have a track where I added pink noise. You could also use white noise, but in this case I prefer the pink noise over the white noise. If you don't know the difference between white noise and pink noise is every frequency of the hearing spectrum, so from 20 Hz to 20 kHz at the same level, so they all have the same energy. This means that due to the hearing curve of our ears, it feels rather harsh, so with a lot of high end. Pink noise has again all the frequencies of the hearing spectrum, but not at the same technical energy level, but at the energy level that reflects the hearing curve of our ears. That's why it doesn't seem so harsh. You can already see that I have used more plugins on this technique. Let's listen to why that is the case. So first of all, I will disable all the plugins except the pink noise generator. And there you have the pink noise. Then I added BX Solo just to make the sound mono, because this pink noise generator is stereo and I don't want a stereo signal for that. Then again I have used FabFilter Pro G, this time in the clean gate setting, and I sent the snare top mic to the sidechain of it. So now every time the snare top has a signal on it, this gate opens and we hear a short burst of the pink noise. Let's listen to that. Without the gate, then I added Pro C2, a compressor, to add more attack to the signal. Then Fab Filter Saturn for some saturation to add some length to the signal. And also volume. Then Pro Q3 to EQ the signal. Then also little plate from Sound Toys, just because I thought the signal sounds awful on its own and with some reverb it has more depth to it. Sounds kinda strange, but let's listen to it in the context of everything. Now first without this pink noise and then with it. And now, once again, let's compare this pink noise snare bottom mic to the traditional snare bottom microphone. In this case, it's really hard for me to tell which one is my favorite, because I think this pink noise adds again some depth and size to the snare drum, but that is also because I've used a reverb on the track, so maybe it's because of that. And I think while the original snare bottom mic sounds tighter and more cohesive, so I mean, in this case, for me, it's a tie. So in this case, it would really depend on the rest of the mix, which version I would prefer. I would choose whatever would make the snare sit better in the mix. Now on to tip number 4 to today for better snare bottom mics, and that is to reamp your snare. Yes, you heard right. Reamping the snare is a thing. You obviously have heard of reamping your guitars, but reamping snares or drums in general isn't obviously that common. How can you do that? Well, you just place a speaker in front of your snare drum, you mic the snare drum, and then you send your snare top recording to the speaker. I mean, we all know the leakage that snare bottom wires produce. In a rehearsal space when you want to tune your guitar, always the snare bottom wires they are ringing with it and they are annoying. But in this case, we take advantage of that fact. So here you can see a video on how I made the setup. A little note, just for fun, I used a different snare, so not the original snare that I used for the drum recording. And now let's listen to it. I want to talk shortly about this plugin. This is a time adjustment delay, and I added a negative delay amount of about 470 samples to this reamped snare bottom signal. I did this to make sure that this reamped snare signal is in phase with my original snare signal, because due to the digital analog conversion and then the distance from the speaker to the snare drum and then again the analog digital conversion, you get a noticeable latency on your reamped snare bottom mic. This is why I added this plugin. Now let's listen to the whole drum mix with this reamped signal. reamped signal in solo. And now once again, let's compare that to the original snare bottom mic. Here, the winner for me is the original snare bottom mic, maybe because I've used a different snare drum for the reamping, but I feel like the original snare bottom mic just feels more cohesive and tighter and yeah, just better. And now on to the final tip for today, tip number 5, and that is to make a drum sample out of your actual snare drum that you have in front of you, but using the overhead microphones. I feel like this technique has the most natural sound to it, and you can also make the snare wider because usually you are using stereo overheads. So you could say that you have a stereo snare bottom mic when you use the overheads for the snare bottom signal. I mean, it makes sense that this has the most natural sound to it, because when you think about how you usually hear a snare drum in a room, it is with quite a distance and at ear level. Usually you don't put your head right there on the snare head. So if you use your overhead to recreate the sizzle of a snare drum, you will have natural and great sounding results. Let's listen to it. So what I did in this case was I recorded some hits of the snare drum. You could now make a real slate trigger instrument out of it, or a contact instrument. By the way, if you want to learn how to do that, I have 2 videos on my channel. But for the sake of this video, I just opted to copy and paste them in at every hit of the snare drum. So we'll first listen to a version using just one overhead. So to have a mono overhead used as the snare bottom mic. And then I will also use the stereo version. Let's compare that to the traditional bottom mic. Obviously, this has more room to it, so it sounds more lively, more excitement. And now, the real fun, we will use both overhead microphones to recreate the snare bottom microphone. I adjusted the level of the right overhead to make the snare sit directly in the center, and now let's listen to this. And now one final comparison between the traditional snare bottom mic and the stereo overheads. So there we go, these are 5 non-traditional snare bottom mic techniques, and I hope that these tips will help you to get a better drum sound. As always, thank you for watching, and please subscribe to this channel for more music production tips. See you next time, bye!